Hello, my name is Benjamin Miss, and today we will be discussing developmental cognition. In this chapter, we will discuss the development of the mind. Understanding how the mind develops as a child matures can help us understand how the adult mind works. We will see how the development of the mind is typically studied, and what areas offer excellent opportunities for us to understand how the mind works. We will discuss multiple stage theories that attempt to describe human development as a progression from one level of functioning to another. Overview. Classical models of child development center on developmental milestones. In regards to cognition, developmental milestones represent changes in the child's thinking as their brains and problem-solving abilities change with maturation. The two great thinkers from the 20th century that shaped developmental psychology, Jean Piaget and Lev Vygotsky, held very different views on development. Interestingly, these differences were shaped by the experiences and environments in which they lived. Both born in 1896, the Swiss Piaget and Russian Vygotsky watched the world rapidly change around them. For years, children had been viewed as tiny adults. Just as we assume that others are similar to ourselves, most adults assume children think in similar ways to ourselves. Piaget created a series of activities to assess the changing cognitive abilities of children, influenced by the individualism of his Western culture. Vygotsky viewed children as social creatures, heavily influenced by the industrialization brought about by the rapid changes caused by the Bolshevik Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Empire. Vygotsky focused on the adaptability of the mind as Russians went from living on farms to living in cities as the Soviet Union transformed into an industrial power. It makes sense, then, that Vygotsky is associated with the hands-on social interaction component of learning. He gives us the idea of the zone of proximal development, where a child can achieve more through carefully designed tasks with the assistance of a teacher, allowing the child to model and eventually acquire those abilities. Think of how you might attend a math class, like statistics, and while in class, you can follow along and perform problems that would have been a greater struggle without the assistance from a teacher. You are able to achieve more with assistance by making complex concepts accessible. Teachers allow us to achieve more than we are capable of. It takes a great deal of work in order to assess the child's ability and understand what will help them perform at a higher level. The main character in Good Will Hunting famously derided the necessity of teachers, telling the Harvard students that they wasted $150,000 on an education you could have got for $1.50 in late fees at the public library. However, that character was portrayed as a once-in-a-generation genius. Clearly, we cannot all learn that way. For both child and adult learners, it can be difficult to see a goal and understand how to get there on our own. Perhaps you've come across an abstract equation in a research paper. Without assistance, it may seem impossible to figure out how to learn what is necessary to understand that equation. Vygotsky's teacher might be able to assist you in understanding something beyond your grasp. At least, a teacher should understand how to get us where we need to be. Having died young, Vygotsky has had less of an influence on modern child development than Piaget. The two thinkers did agree on a lot and communicated for a short period before Vygotsky's death. Both of them could be considered constructivists, who would agree that modern educational practices fail at maximizing the potential of children. Constructivists believe that the experiences of learners allow them to construct or build their own knowledge. We are not empty vessels into which knowledge can be poured, but rather active minds that benefit from interacting with and experiencing the material we are trying to learn. Yet much of modern education involves students sitting in classrooms, listening to the wisdom of a teacher, which the students are then expected to memorize. An ongoing debate in developmental cognition is whether development occurs in stages. Is there a before and after, where a child's thinking changes so drastically that they have reached a fundamentally different stage of development? Or is development continuous, where a child might function at a higher level on one day and a lower level on another? Piaget, stages. Piaget observed children, mainly his own, and devised tests to assess their cognitive abilities. Piaget arranged development into 4 stages as the child's thinking becomes more cognitively adult-like. The first stage is sensory-motor. The name is a helpful description. Comprising the first 2 years of life, an infant is most focused on coordinating senses with movement in order to interact with the world. This stage is broken down into 6 substages, which describe the milestones of development as the infant improves their coordination and attention, and their experience is characterized as trial and error. The second stage is called pre-operational. Here, a child focuses on the rapid cognitive growth that allows complex skills to develop, like language. The goal is to develop symbolic thought, where a word or object might be used to represent something else. The third stage is concrete operational, which involves basic logical processes. Children at this stage are learning to solve problems in their head. The final stage is formal operational, which is where the thinking becomes adult-like. The child is able to imagine the impossible, learn to consider multiple points of view, and come up with multiple solutions to problems. There is debate about the qualitative differences of Piaget's stages. The tests he and others have devised give us an insight into how children think differently. Piaget would use the ability to successfully complete these tasks as indicators of the child's functional level. Interestingly, some adults still fail some of these tasks, especially conservation. Conservation. This is a classic concept that many find surprising. There are a number of conservation tasks, but the most well-known is conservation of volume, which most children fail until adolescence. Consider this example. We see that there are 2 cups of water that appear equal in every way. The cups are the same size and hold the same amount of water. Water is poured from one cup into a taller, thinner cylinder. The child is then asked whether the tall cup has more water than the short cup, whether the short cup has more water than the tall cup, or whether both containers have the same amount of water. Younger children will usually say the taller container has more water, while older children will understand that both containers contain the same amount of water. Sarcastic teenagers might mention that a few drops were lost during the water transfer between 2 containers. Reversibility is part of the ability to understand conservation. Reversibility is the understanding that many tasks can be undone. You can always pour the water from the tall container back into the original container, and it will contain the same amount it did before, when both cups were equal. You can see the consequences of development and how our understanding of the world makes it easier to handle situations. For instance, a child might become distraught that they didn't get to perform a task, such as tying their own shoelaces. Once a child understands reversibility, they understand they can have a chance to do it too. Many things can be undone and done again. At the same time, the child is developing better control over their emotions, demonstrating that there are many interactive components involved in understanding a child's range of emotional development. You may find it interesting that there is a conservation task that can be used to cause failure in most adults. For instance, Think of two bags of marbles. One bag contains 20 red marbles, and the other bag contains 20 green marbles. First, I will take 5 marbles from each jar. I put the 5 red marbles in the green jar, and the 5 green marbles in the red jar. There are still 20 marbles in each jar, 15 of one color and 5 of the other. Now comes the tricky part. It is important to understand you cannot see inside the jars. I will take 5 marbles from the mostly green jar without looking, and 5 marbles from the mostly red jar without looking, and I will switch them. Here are your questions. Are there more marbles in the green jar than green marbles? Are there more red marbles in the green jar than green marbles in the red jar? Are there more green marbles in the red jar than red marbles in the green jar? Are there an equal number of green marbles in the red jar as there are red marbles in the green jar? Or is it impossible to tell? If you find this problem difficult, you are not alone. What this example demonstrates is that if you overtax your ability to track something, it appears you might no longer understand conservation. However, you probably understood the example with the water without any trouble. The solution to the marble problem relies on our understanding that there are 20 marbles in each bag, and many people lost track of this fact when trying to figure out what's happening when we transfer the marbles. Since there are 20 marbles in each bag, if there are 6 red marbles in the bag of mostly green marbles, there must be 6 green marbles in the bag of mostly red marbles. We can't know how many without looking, but we can know for certain that there are equal numbers of red marbles in the green marble bag as there are green marbles in the red marble bag. Theory of mind. The classic test for theory of mind involves demonstrating a scenario for a child and asking the child questions to understand whether a child can take perspective. Children before the age of approximately 4½ tend to fail this test. Consider this example. Sally has a red ball and places it into the basket. Sally then leaves the room and can't see what's happening inside the room. Anne takes the red ball out of the basket and places it into a box. Sally comes back into the room and wants to play with the red ball. Where will she look first? The question should be obvious to you as an adult. Sally left the ball in the basket, so she should think it's there. A 4-year-old, however, might say she'd look in the box first. The lesson from theory of mind is that younger children believe that you know what's in their mind. They see no difference between themselves and others. A 3-year-old might grab a toy from another child because they want the toy, and the 3-year-old cannot imagine that the other child would also want that toy. A 3-year-old cannot control their impulses with any regularity, but will still behave when you are not looking because they believe you know what's in their mind and that you will know if they did something they are not supposed to do. Once a child develops theory of mind, that child then develops a new cognitive superpower, the ability to lie. Once a child understands that our minds and desires are separate, this ability to take perspective can lead them to better understand sharing. It can also allow them to understand that if you don't see the child do something, you don't know what they did. The broken lamp can now be blamed on the dog or the sibling. Theory of mind might just be what makes us human. This ability to take perspective is quite powerful. Once I put myself in your position, I can predict your behavior and work with you. Together we can hunt, share, and plan. Alone, we scuttle across the floors of silent seas. Together, we build a civilization. Information processing theory. In contrast to Piaget, information processing theorists argue that stages only appear to exist. Piaget stages have been shown to be inconsistent, especially during the transitional time between stages, where children sometimes appear to be functioning in one stage and sometimes in another. Children may succeed in some aspects of object permanence, for instance, and fail at other aspects. Over the first year of life, Infants develop the understanding that objects still exist, even if they are not able to see them. This process seems to happen slowly rather than all at once. An infant may retrieve a hidden object one time, but not another. According to information processing theory, the mind does not have stages, but rather abilities that change as the brain size and organization increase. At birth, the brain is approximately 1/3 the size of the adult brain. By 3 months old, an infant's brain is nearly half the size of the adult brain. However, the brain is still immature, lacking in organization. A 2-year-old has a brain that is approximately 80% the size of the adult brain. However, the 2-year-old has approximately 50% more synapses than the adult brain. During development, synapses, connections between neurons, form randomly throughout the brain. Through what is called neural Darwinism, synapses that are used frequently become stronger, and synapses that are not used disappear. This means that the infant brain is processing a lot of irrelevant information, attempting to build up a mental understanding of the world. In information processing theory, increases in brain size and increases in organization lead to the development of mental constructs that allow the developing human to interact with the world. These are not hardwired, but rather an emergent property of the child's ability. The model for understanding would be like the computer. Fundamentally, computation has not changed. Machines encode information in ones and zeros. However, as processing power has increased, our experience has changed. For instance, old arcade machines had large processing units that ran what we would now consider to be simple programs. Modern computers allow for virtual reality gaming experiences. Someone looking at these two models might think a VR system is fundamentally different from an arcade console, yet the basic computer functions the same way. But as processing power increases, the computer can handle more complex programs. Psychosexual development. Freud. Sigmund Freud, born in 1856, was as much a product of his time as the other thinkers discussed here. Freud grew up in the Victorian era, a time of sexual repression where children were viewed more as short adults to be commanded rather than nurtured. Freud's family was Jewish, and Freud observed discrimination and oppression firsthand throughout his life, including witnessing the rise of the Nazis as the Jews were blamed for post-World War I German poverty and diminished influence. Freud was brilliant, teaching himself multiple languages as a young child and delving into scientific study. When we consider these factors, it is easy to see why Freud viewed the world so negatively. Yet he still believed that he could help people, developing psychoanalytical talk therapy and endeavoring to make it accessible to the masses. We have a tendency to deride Sigmund Freud today. Though brilliant, his anger and belief that he was right about his understanding of the mind led him to try to convince the world that his theories were correct. And in many ways, Freud was right. He argued that mental illness could be understood by studying the childhoods of his patients. He suggested that sexual repression was responsible for many psychological problems. He famously described our impulsive desires as the id, the ego that attempts to get our desires met in socially acceptable ways, and the superego as our conscience, learned through our upbringing. Freud described the conscious and unconscious minds, the conscious being what we are aware of, and the unconscious driving our behavior in ways we are typically unaware of. In regards to child development, Freud developed what he calls his psychosexual stages. Freud linked many adult psychopathologies to problems with development. For instance, if you chew gum or smoke, Freud would say you are stuck in the oral stage of development that lasts from birth until you are around a year old. If you are extremely neat and organized, you might have problems with potty training during your anal stage, which lasts until around 3. If you're selfish, you might be stuck on the phallic stage that lasts until around 5. If you are asexual or find it difficult to achieve sexual fulfillment, Freud would argue that you are stuck in his latency period that lasts until puberty. Finally, the genital stage is the puberty through adult level of psychosexual development. While most researchers find little or no evidence to support Freud's beliefs, he did an excellent job of describing the times he lived in, and his promotion of psychological therapy opened a door to the field that helped lead to our modern scientific study of the mind, mental illness, and treatment. His focus on the influence of childhood on our adult behaviors helped us to understand the importance of healthy childhood experiences and relationships. We can criticize Freud's negative attitudes towards women and the human race in general, as well as his theories that are based on outmoded cultural assumptions and observations. Psychosocial development. Erikson. Erik Erikson started with Freud's psychosexual developmental theory and modified it into a psychosocial theory that applies to the lifespan. Erikson believed that the development of a healthy personality is dependent on the ability of the individual to reconcile their needs with the needs and expectations of society. The ages of the early stages line up fairly well with Freud's psychosexual developmental stages, but expanded to cover the lifespan. Each stage is a conflict between two outcomes, the first being trust versus mistrust, and lasting from birth until around 1.5 years. At birth, an infant cannot self-soothe or calm their emotional frustrations. When the infant cries, the infant needs to know that their caretaker will respond and help. If the needs are not met, the person may develop anxiety and have difficulty trusting people. This is also the key period where healthy attachment is building, and failure here could be related to lifelong relationship issues. The second stage is autonomy versus shame and doubt, and lasts until around age 3. During this time, the toddler is developing a sense of independence and doing things for him or herself. This includes the process of potty training, which should be handled with encouragement and avoid focusing on accidents. The third stage of initiative versus guilt covers the next 2 years, lasting until around age 5. The child wants to explore their world, assert themselves, play with other children, and make up games. The child will need to be encouraged and also learn limits. Stage 4 is industry versus inferiority and lasts until adolescence, around age 12. The child is in school, learning academic skills and social competencies that are valued by society. The child is developing the ability to set and achieve goals and requires support and reinforcement as they develop a sense of competence in their abilities. Adolescence until early adulthood, around age 18, is dominated by Erikson's identity versus role confusion. During this period, the adolescent experiences rapid physiological and psychological change. They will also experiment with various roles as they sort out their identity. For Erikson, 2 key aspects of identity are their sexuality and their occupational goals. It is important to support and encourage the adolescent to find what is right for themselves at this time, or they may face confusion and deep unhappiness. The next period is called intimacy versus isolation and comprises early adulthood until around the age of 40. During this time, most people are developing their careers and family lives, and the focus is on developing intimate, loving relationships, particularly with a long-term committed partner. Those who avoid intimacy and commitment may feel lonely and depressed. After this stage comes the generativity versus stagnation of middle adulthood, lasting until around age 60. During this time, the focus is on having a lasting impact on the world through creativity and nurture. This can mean raising children, a successful career, and community involvement. Otherwise, an individual may feel unproductive and disconnected. The final stage, according to Erikson, is called ego integrity versus despair. This takes place around the age of retirement, when we reflect on our experience and decide whether our life was valuable and meaningful. Those who feel they wasted their lives or failed in their goals may feel despair and hopelessness. Though Erikson's stages are considered descriptive rather than predictive, you can likely relate to and understand how he characterizes where you are in your life. However, Erikson does not necessarily tell us how we can individually resolve these personality conflicts, or how we will be affected by failure to resolve a conflict at one stage. Like other stage theories, the boundaries are not entirely clear, and the age cutoffs can vary from person to person. We can also experience more than one crisis at a time, with someone still developing their identity while also developing an understanding of intimacy. Moral development. For a long time, the study of moral development centered around stage theories as described by Piaget and extended by Lawrence Kohlberg. These were a good starting place, but relied heavily on the Western and male biases of the researchers. Piaget assessed morality development the same way he studied cognitive development, which was to give children scenarios and ask them what is right and wrong. Likely, the most well-known of these is called Heinz's dilemma, and it looks like this. Heinz's wife has a type of cancer. A cure exists, but the cure is very expensive. Heinz's wife will die without the cure. Heinz borrows as much as he can from family and friends, but does not collect nearly enough. Should Heinz steal the drug? Answer yes or no. Explain your decision. Their reasoning is more important than whether they decided to steal the drug or not. Based on your answer, Kohlberg would classify your morality into one of three main stages. Before the child has theory of mind, they act simply based on what they believe their caregiver wants them to do because they believe the caregiver knows what is in their mind. Once they start to develop a sense of individual morality, Kohlberg calls the first stage pre-conventional morality. This stage focuses on getting what they want while avoiding punishment. The second stage is conventional morality and is based on social expectations and laws. The third stage is based on a true internalized morality based on universal principles of right and wrong. For a long time, Kohlberg's model was widely accepted, but over time its popularity diminished. The problem with Kohlberg, and with Piaget for that matter, are that those models are limited in both descriptive and predictive value. A longitudinal study that tracked moral development showed that over more than 20 years, young Western males do tend to move from pre-conventional morality to conventional morality. They view morals through the lens of social expectations and law and order. However, most never reach a strong, internalized post-conventional morality. Kohlberg's model also fails to account for gender and cultural differences. Moral cognition is difficult to define and understand. Certainly, we have millennia of philosophical and religious thought, but in many ways, morality is personal, tied to the individual rather than a universal set of principles. For instance, few people ever seem to actively choose their own religious or moral beliefs, finding it easier to adopt the beliefs of their cultural group. Support for this notion comes from the support for interracial marriage and gay marriage. Before 1967, the majority of Americans were against interracial marriages. In many places, they were illegal. After the Supreme Court invalidated those laws, in a short period of time, the majority of Americans supported interracial marriage. The same is true for gay marriage. As states stopped the restrictions and the Supreme Court legalized it across the United States, opinions followed the law. More recently, Nancy Eisenberg proposed a new set of stages that are less rigid and more inclusive. Moral development relies on the abilities to take perspective, empathize, and develop a sense of self and one's own values. This means that understanding what the child is capable of helps us to understand morality. Eisenberg also used scenarios to develop a set of stages of what she called prosocial moral reasoning. Prosocial means doing things for the betterment of others and society, which is the opposite of antisocial, which is being against society. In Eisenberg's determination, the ability of children to think morally changes as they develop and can understand and take multiple perspectives. Her stages begin in preschool and track through high school. 1. Hedonistic, direct reciprocity. Morality is based on what feels good right now. Children can appear selfish, and sharing is transactional. If a child gives another child something, they must immediately get something in return. 2. Needs-oriented. A child must give away a toy or food because someone else wants it more than they do at the time. They do not think of the long-term consequences. For instance, they no longer have their lunch to eat at lunchtime because they gave it to a friend who didn't bring a snack. 3. Approval stereotyped. Morality focuses on what others expect. Social pressures influence behavior. Children and teens may not behave in ways we consider moral, but they are doing what they think their peer group wants. 4a. Self-reflective, empathic. This is where we start to understand that helping others makes us feel good, and being unkind makes us feel bad. 4b. Transitional. An in-between phase where moral decision-making may be inconsistent. We are working to understand our own values. 5. Internalized. Having developed a strong set of consistent moral values, we are confident in our behavior. Notably, many people do not reach this stage. Children begin their moral development with concern for themselves and their own needs. If they give you something, they want something in return. Then, many children behave in a way that appears to be selfless. They base their morality on what their peers values and eventually learn that helping others feels good and hurting others feels bad. Often, we can appear at different levels based on the situation. In Eisenberg's theory, it is still difficult to attain the highest level, though overall her stages are tied to cognitive and emotional development and better describe how children behave from a pro-social perspective. Language development. The section on language will consider language in greater detail. Language development follows a fairly consistent course, with abilities rapidly changing as the brain develops in infancy and early childhood. The human capacity for language is far beyond that of any other known species, to the point where we can easily say that we consider language is unique to humans and that other species have various degrees of communication. Children go through a developmental period between approximately the ages of 2 and 6. They babble and eventually say their first word around the time of their first birthday, but they don't begin to put sentences together until later. A word must have both a referent and consistency, meaning when an infant says mama or dada, they have to do it regularly when they want their mama or dada. A word doesn't have to be what we would consider correct. Goggy instead of doggy, when regularly used to refer to the family dog, counts as a word. The non-word baba, when used to referring to a blanket or toy, would count as a word. However, it is not until around 18 months that language really takes off, and by the age of 5 or 6, a child has developed a complete understanding of the structure of their native language. Young children engage in specific processes as they develop the required fine motor skills needed to pronounce words. The classic paschetti instead of spaghetti demonstrates multiple processes. Metathesis, which is switching sounds to ease pronunciation, is present when they split up S and P and switch the order. Assimilation, making things similar is present in changing the G to a K sound by removing what is called voicing to make the G more like the S that precedes it in Paschetti. G and K differ only in voicing, which is vibrating the vocal cords. S is also voiceless like K. You can see the difference between pairs of consonants that are voiced and voiceless by putting your fingers on your larynx and making a Z sound and an S sound. You can even go back and forth between these two sounds and feel the difference in your vocal cords. English-speaking children have difficulty with some sounds more than others. In fact, around the world, children tend to find it easier to make sounds like P and T, and they have a hard time making the first sounds in the English word this, or at the end of the word 12th. Some of the more difficult sounds may not be successfully acquired by children until after age 5. Thank you. I hope you've enjoyed this discussion of developmental cognition, and I look forward to more talks in the future.